This is Let Your Voice Be Heard, right here on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem.
We are back and headed to Cuba for vacation.
I really want to go to Cuba.
Well, you actually, that's not Cuban. You actually can go to Cuba.
Can I?
Yeah, you can. There's ways to do it right now using an educational visa. There's programs that are offered through different universities that are, trips that you can take, and they help you to secure the educational visa. You cannot right now just go on vacation without the educational visa, from what I understand, unless you have some other type of visa that allows you to go there. I'm going to get into that in a little more detail. But ultimately, yeah, at some point in the future, and hopefully sooner rather than later, you will be able to just go on vacation there without this educational visa.
Sounds good.
So let's back it up, though, and start from the beginning. Last Tuesday, the White House announced that the president is going to be removing Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism. Cuba has been on this list since 1982 because of its backing of revolutionary movements in Latin America and in Spain. The president made this decision after the State Department did a review of Cuba's presence on that list and after a historic meeting that the president had with Cuban leader Raul Castro. The review began back in December. The president announced back in December that he was seeking to reestablish diplomatic ties with Cuba after 5 decades, which is 50 years, for those of you who don't know, of hostility that began during the Cold War, which we're not going to get into the Cold War, but if you remember, that was our long-standing dispute with Russia, or actually with the Soviet Union. At the time, it was the Soviet Union. And administration officials said that the U.S. continues to have concerns with some of Cuba's behaviors, but they are not factors in its terrorist listing. So,
right.
How did this all come about? Well, the White House submitted a report to lawmakers certifying that Cuba has not provided support for terrorist groups for 6 months, and they stated that the government has received assurances from the Cuban government that Cuba will not do so in the future, ever. Members of Congress now have 45 days to review the president's decision before it can be formally approved. Congress can block the president from taking Cuba off of the list, and the House and Senate can pass a joint resolution prohibiting it, but Obama can veto that move as well, and then they would have to override that veto, which, as we know, is very difficult. Administration officials have said that they still do have separate concerns about establishing an embassy in Cuba and about the embargo, such as, for example, whether diplomats will be able to travel in the country freely and speak to people without interference by the Cuban government. And with respect to the embargo, American companies that are hoping to be able to import or export, mostly export consumer goods from the U.S. to Cuba or to build hotels there, will still face a tangle of different sanctions that are made up of the trade embargo. That trade embargo is a very complex set of laws, rules, and regulations and executive orders that only Congress can eliminate. So even with the president's historic announcement, we would still need congressional action to get rid of the embargo. Now, the president did ease the embargo back in January when the government announced that Americans can travel to Cuba a little more freely, as I had already said, and they can send more money to ordinary Cubans. And the government also said it would allow broader exports of U.S. telecommunications equipment in an attempt to get the country to open up via the internet, essentially, and that Americans who do travel to Cuba will be able to use their credit cards there, which will be great because part of the problem was that you had to spend all cash. But companies still will not be able to invest in Cuba or do business with the state except for importing goods that are intended to help Cubans, like food, medicine, telecommunications equipment. And even those American exporters with special licenses to sell to Cuba cannot offer Cuban importers credit, which means they will not be able to have commercial imports of Cuban goods. However, this question about when can I get some cigars and when can I get some rum, because I'm sure you've been tuning into this whole segment and that's what you really want to know.
We want the answers.
You cannot, commercial companies, as I already mentioned, cannot import these goods into the U.S. right now. However, if you go to Cuba, you are allowed to bring back $400 worth of goods, and out of that $400 worth of goods, $100 of those goods can be alcohol and tobacco.
That's it?
No more than $100
How much do you need, Stanley?
worth of the goods that you can bring back can be alcohol and tobacco. So if you do go to Cuba on one of these educational trips, or you obtain a visa not through for educational purposes, but one of the other types of visas, which, as I mentioned, will be easier to get, you can bring back $100 worth of rum or cigars.
Per person?
Per person.
Look at Stan.
Right,
Is that your strategy? Like,
I'm a
you're just
business
trying to
leader.
scheme
This
how
is
you can
mine.
bring back all this rum and cigars.
Wanna
Do
go
you
to
smoke
Cuba,
cigars?
Selena?
I would love to go to Cuba.
All
Well,
right, you got a big purse?
here's a big caveat to that. You may not resell any of those goods,
Why am I
once
selling
you
it?
get back money, supply and demand, just like Taman wants that bagel, right?
I'm about to smoke all that cigar.
This is simple microeconomics. If
I don't
there's a
believe in
high
science.
demand for Cuban cigars and there's a low amount of supply, the supply is low, then you can raise the price as much as you want, and therefore you could make a killing off of selling these cigars.
You think if I sell it on a block, they really gonna go and call the
Yeah,
IRS
that's what I'm
on me?
saying. How are they gonna know if you do? I
Well,
mean, you
but
just
it's
gave me the
fine,
idea,
I mean,
Alyssa.
That goes back to anything. How does the government know that you sell drugs which are illegal? Listen, as your lawyer, no, I'm not your lawyer.
I would love
because
you to be my
you
lawyer.
did not retain me, but just generally speaking, because I cannot give specific legal advice, I would generally advise that if you do bring back $100 worth of Cuban cigars or rum, you don't resell it because you will be committing a crime.
What if you give it to someone and they give you a gift of $150
Yeah, that's what. Or a hug. What if they like, hey,
with money?
This is very similar to what goes on, as we talked about in a previous Quickie, about what you can do in D.C. about marijuana.
Right, exactly.
It's the same kind of gift economy. You can give me a hug, and I can give you a cigar, because that's your hug. As much as nice it is, it's not something of value. But if you gave me $100 with that hug, that would be a resale, and that would be something of value. That's
what
not
if
allowed.
I asked for a friend to borrow $150 and then they gave it to me and they're like, hey, do you have any more of that Cuban rum? And I go, oh, I do have a bottle left if you would like that bottle for free.
look at her plotting and scheming.
Well, yeah, because then they still have to pay you back the $150 they loan. That's two separate transactions.
Alyssa, can I borrow $150?
I don't know. That depends.
Well,
It depends what you need $150 for.
For this weed. No.
the disclaimer, that was a complete joke.
I don't know why I said
joke.
I was trying to say for this cigar,
Did
but I thought of a curse
did you get
word.
Marilyn into a situation that you need to now borrow $150
What?
for?
No.
So you meant to say cigar
Yeah, I'm going to say cigar.
because
but then
you're
I
not
almost thought of
endorsing a transaction of
No.
that nature.
No. And then I was trying to say a curse word, and I said, oh, yeah, we can't curse because of FCC. And then weed came out.
You
I
know,
don't
just
Yeah.
to finish up, in order to really fix the embargo situation, the president or a
Sorry,
future
Jason.
president obviously would have to certify to Congress that a transitional or democratically elected government was now in power in Cuba. Alternatively, Congress could vote on its own to get rid of the embargo. And once Congress repealed the embargo, then commercial exporters would be able to import and export, or mostly import, Cuban goods and then resell them for commercial value. But my final words on this is that, I personally think this is a good idea. I know some people disagree, but dropping Cuba from the terrorism list is part of a welcome, as far as I'm concerned, is part of a welcome dismantling of the isolation wall that we erected more than a half a century ago. It has no purpose, as far as I'm concerned, in today's world. And I do think Congress should lift the embargo. The administration should continue to loosen restrictions on travel, trade, and banking. It's time to let the Cold War die out and to move forward into the future.
We are so long overdue. And speaking of overdue and things in Cuba, they just started getting Wi-Fi hotspots in Cuba. But I was like, I'm against it. And here's why. No, because I was like, you know what? They have their own culture, and you know, once they start getting access to everything else, I don't want it to like infuse in their their culture is authentic and
Their
wholesome.
culture is authentic because they're not allowed to do
exactly.
anything.
And I think they
So
should
you
keep
wanna-
it like
So
I
you
want
want to keep people oppressed.
I want to go to the Cuba, the real Cuba. I don't want to go there and see McDonald's and hear them speaking English. I want to experience the real culture of Cuba. That's why I was like, I want to go now.
Well, I mean,
before
you
it
sound
starts
like
to
somebody who
simulate.
wants to experience the real culture of the South. So that's why we should keep people in slavery.
So,
No,
guys, we have to go.
No, Jason wants to say something. Really
No,
quick.
all I wanted to say,
Jason, as our Afro Latina, please.
as the tenant, token Afro Latino, all I can say, voy para allá. Vamos a visitar Cuba.
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 Viva la Cuba. Okay, and on that note, we have to say goodbye. But guess what? We'll be back next Sunday right here on Let Your Voice Be Heard. And you can check us out on iTunes. Download our podcast at LYVBH Radio. And we'll see you next week.
Mira, mira, ven aquí. Mira, mira, ven aquí. Ven aquí, ven aquí. Mira, mira, ven aquí. Mira, mira, ven aquí. Mira, mira, ven aquí. Ven aquí, ven aquí.
You know me, I got money. Being broke is not funny. I'm so serious, mommy. Get it in with your bobby and follow me, cause I got tree. And I'm higher than mountain. And your body's bada bing. I don't snitch, I don't sing. I don't Kanye album.
Hi, this is Flo Wiley, inviting you to listen to Black Beat New York every Thursday night at 6. Black Beat New York is all about what's happening on the arts and culture scene in New York City, with a special emphasis on what's going on in the sweet village of Harlem. Celebrity interviews, ticket giveaways, Black Beat weekly events calendar, and I'll play for you some of the finest music you'll hear on the radio anywhere. Every Thursday at 6, Black Beat New York, The Flo Wiley Show.